I just gave a talk at Rutgers a few days ago, which was the far right today, which is one I've done many, many times over. It went very smooth, but you can also watch it online. This one is actually new. It might not be as smooth, but at least it's original. When I was invited to give a keynote on this topic, I responded that I actually don't know that much about populism and religion. And I would probably have said no had I not taught a grad course on religion and politics and felt a little bit more comfortable about the religion literature. But also, while I won't claim that I've read everything on populism, which is impossible because it's just all over the place at the moment, religion barely ever features in, I would say, an active sense. And as we have seen in the workshop that we had today, and as I will argue as well in this talk, particularly with regard to the populist radical right in Europe, religion has returned, but in the form of Islamophobia, which is not really about religion in a sense, because it is just about the other. But I think there are some elements there where it has influenced it. And so I'm going to argue that there is a long and complex relationship between populism and religion, that theoretically there is an inherent contradiction between populism and religion. But in practice, we find many combinations of it. But if I look at it today, I mostly see a transactional alliance. So it's not an ideological convergence, but it's two agendas which can be combined for profit. So first we do the terminology, just so that you understand how I use populism, an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people. Now let me highlight a couple of things here, because while this definition is in many ways very similar to many other definitions that are used, and I would say there's a lot of people who use my definition, very few people use my definition as I use my definition. And so what is absolutely crucial are two elements. One is monism and the other one is moralism. Monism sits here in the homogeneous. Like, in my understanding, the people is, not are. Like, it's one group. All members of the people share exactly the same values and interests. Similarly for the elite, all of them are the same and are bad, because the second part is that the distinction between the two groups is not on the basis of power, money, or class, it's on the basis of morality. The people, all of them are pure in a moral sense, not an ethnic or racial sense. And all elite are corrupt. And then finally, I argue it's an ideology, albeit a thin ideology. I will come back to that. Now, there's a lot of debate in academia rather than outside of that, whether it's an ideology or a political style or a discourse, etc., etc. I personally think that that is virtually irrelevant for about 90% of the research that we do. So I don't study, for example, Donald Trump, the man. I study Donald Trump, the politician. And if Donald Trump himself is an elitist, which he is, but that is irrelevant if he presents himself as a populist, right? And so whether people use a discourse, whether they believe that discourse or not, doesn't matter much. And the other reason why I think it is a bit more than a style or a discourse is it is sometimes presented as populism is a discourse to gain power. But that would mean that as soon as you have power, that you would let it go. And what we see is they don't. Actually, they use populism to justify individual policies. And so again, do they believe it? Probably not, but who cares? There are a lot of nationalists, liberals, socialists around who also don't believe it, who just want to have power. Now, what is so funny is that no one can write an article about populism without saying that there is no one definition of it and like all these kind of things. And I've done that myself too. The thing is that, of course, that kind of applies to almost every crucial term in political science. I take democracy, but then I was actually coming across, like, what is religion? Now, if you think that populism has been defined all over the place, or is being applied to very different movements and periods and regions, obviously religion is even more diverse as a term and even more difficult to capture. By and large, I took this one, but it doesn't matter too much for what I'm arguing. Religion is to believe in and reverence for a supernatural power, recognized as the creator and governor of the universe. Even that has all kind of problems, but I don't think that is the most important thing here. Important is that we have two terms that are problematic. What's also important is that that is very often the case. So when I look at the theory of it, then as I said, I believe that populism and religion, there's an inherent tension between the two. And that has to do with conflicting supremacies. For populism, like, it is vox populi, vox Dei. Like, voice of the people is the voice of God. For religion, vox Dei is vox Dei, right? And it's a fundamental difference because ultimate supremacy in populism, allegedly, is the people. There is nothing above that. But in religion, at least the Abrahamic ones, it is God in whatever form. Now there's another element to that, is that there are quite a lot of religions that have in some way the idea of original sin. The idea that the people are sinful, which again is completely in opposition to populism. And so purely at the theoretical level, this combination is problematic. Now, I do believe that there is a logical argument to be made that there should be diversity within religions. There are some religions that are much more popular, or horizontal if you want, than others. So, for example, I could see that Protestantism could be more open to populism than Catholicism, which is strongly hierarchical, right? The same actually with Islam, which generally has a much more decentralized kind of structure where individual people can become religious leaders, even laymen, that kind of thing. Logically, that should be more open to populism. However, what we see is pretty much that populism and religion is combined. Now, how is that possible? First of all, populism is a thin ideology. And what I mean by that, or better, what Michael Frieden means by that, is that it only speaks to a very limited number of issues in politics. So according to populism, you just know that you have a corrupt elite and good people, and that politics should be in line with that people. But it doesn't say much about what economic system you should have. Right? It doesn't speak about all kind of different things, which means that in practice, populism is often only successful if it can attach itself to another ideology. What my friend Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser and I call a host ideology, which on the right, radical right, generally is nativism, a xenophobic form of nationalism, and on the left is some form of socialism. So populism generally is combined with something else, and really can be combined with virtually everything because it is so thin. So why not with religion? On top of that, we know that real-life politics is often inconsistent. People who argue that the market is the best mechanism for everything can find the state whenever it can help them like push stuff through. So again, populists will do things that might not work exactly in line with the populist belief. And populism and religion have always been combined. Now, always is a bit of a difficult term. When I started working on populism, the general consensus was that it emerged in the mid-19th century. Now there are thousands and thousands of people working on populism, and it's a very profitable business. And of course, the more populism we have, the more business we have. So now I see studies of populism that go back, that predate the Greeks. When I say always, I'm old school, mid-19th century, right? And so the best example comes from this country. So William Jennings Bryan is kind of seen as the leader of the populists here in the US, and who ran actually as a candidate for the Democratic Party twice for president. But Bryan was also an absolute Christian fundamentalist. Had whole tirades against the use of alcohol, for example, and all kind of other stuff. And if you look at some of his speeches, and there's a Cross of Gold speech, it's not just full of Christian terminology, but there is a strong defense of Christianity in it. And there's even some studies that show that the other original populists, who come from Russia, the so-called Narodniki, that among their supporters were also people who were deeply religious and who combined it. And that had a lot to do with the fact that the Narodniki saw the people as the Russian peasant. And the Russian peasant, obviously, was very orthodox at that point in time. So if there is this alliance, that alliance is actually not recent. It's also not specific to one religion. And so these are just some examples. Matteo Salvini is the leader of the Lega Nord, the Northern League in Italy, now the League. He used to be relevant, not so much anymore. And he, out of nowhere, became immensely Catholic. That was roughly the moment when he took over the party and wanted to extend his reach from the north to the south. And so he has been going on and on about Catholicism. Probably never saw a church inside before that, but did. Modi and Hinduism is so strong that many people mistake Hindutva ideology as a religion rather than as a form of nationalism. Now, Deri is a less known person, perhaps. He is the leader of Shas, an Orthodox Judaism party in Israel, which is for the Sephardic Jews, has been described as populist in a lot of the literature on Israel. And then, of course, with Erdogan, with regard to Islam, a lot of work on Erdogan as a populist as well. There are undoubtedly other types of religions where you can link it to populism. So the point is that even though a lot of the literature focuses on Christianity, it's not specific to that. I could imagine, though, that, again, there are certain religions that are much less structured, in which a god or even a few gods play a less hierarchical role, for which it then is a much easier combination with populism and others not. But focusing on kind of the big ones, like we see that it is being combined. Now, what's also important is that, and I made this remark before, it's my annoying remark, but it's like, what does populism as a term actually add to anything? And my point is increasingly very little. And so most of the discussion about populism and something tends to be about right-wing populism, or more specifically about the populist radical right, as I call it. And actually, most of the thing that the populist radical right does is not because of their populism, but because of their nativism, their xenophobic nationalism. And so if you want to understand better whether it is populism or nativism, you have to look at whether left-wing populist and right-wing populist share something, because they don't share much else than the populism. One of the things that obviously religion comes more natural to the populist right, because globally the right is more associated with religion. But it's not exclusive to the right. Chavez, for example, used a lot of religious Christian symbols, but also speech. And we have here Tsipras, who used to be the leader of Syriza in Greece, who also found God overnight, roughly when it became a little bit problematic in his career. The Greek Orthodox Church is incredibly powerful in Greek politics. And so he has embraced religion, the church, as well. So it is not exclusive to the right, but it is more common. I think logically it depends on the role of religion in society. Right? As we had a paper earlier in the workshop that compared Germany and the Netherlands, where the Netherlands is one of the most secularized countries in the world, and Germany has at least part of the country has more Christianity. Like, it makes more sense to combine it with religion in a country where people are religious. And so Chavez in Venezuela, or Greece, Tsipras in Greece, both are countries where the vast majority of people consider themselves religious. And so the left populist will probably use religion in countries that are very religious. Not all. Podemos in Spain, for example, was not particularly religious. Might have helped that their leader was actually not a real populist. It was an old school communist who in an interview literally said that he couldn't sell communism in the 21st century anymore. That's why he used populism. But I think that you will see it in the left, particularly in more religious countries. So looking at it today, why are there more examples? I think in part there's more populism today. Could talk about why that is. I don't really have the answers, but I have some thoughts. With regard to the relationship, I'm thinking about certain developments that have happened in the 21st century and that have significantly affected society and thereby politics. The first is 9/11. And I'm not talking about the attacks of 9/11, I talk about the discourse around those attacks. Collectively, we have decided that this was about Islam. And ever since, Islam has become a major issue in the debate, not only on Europe, but also in many other countries, particularly Islamophobia. Now, what you get is when you define the other in ethno-religious terms, you have to start thinking about what does that say about us. Right? This in-group, out-group differentiation, where you have us and them, is not a perfect mirror, but generally whatever we are, they are not, and the other way around, right? So if I think about my own country, which is the Netherlands, we're totally secular. By and large, even the religious people argue that they're secular. And we have Islam now as a threat. And what you see is that people start to talk about Christianity, which they literally hadn't talked about pretty much since the late 70s. Before, we had a very different distinction. We had the Dutch, and we had Turks, and we had Moroccans. They were Muslim, but that was actually completely irrelevant in our story. They were nationally different. And so they were Turkish Moroccan, and we were Dutch, and somehow that meant things. Now they were Muslim. What did that say about us? And so in the Dutch case, it mostly meant that we were secular. And so in much of the Dutch debate, again, as we've seen before, which wasn't limited to the far right at all, it was that Islam was a threat because it was religion. Here in the US, which actually has at least as much Islamophobia as my country, it's very often the debate is not Islam is a problem because it's a religion, but because it's the wrong religion. Right? And so Islamophobia can have a secular and a religious interpretation. But even in the secular interpretation, you're still going to think about what it means to be secular and your relationship to Christianity. There's another development which is a sensitive issue in the religion and politics and the religion social science, which is secularization. And so the growth of people who do not believe in God. While there's quite a lot of debate about whether that actually happened in the 1970s and 80s, I think if you look at the 21st century, you definitely see an increase, and there are a lot of countries that are either actively secular or passively secular. Like, so if you ask French people, like, what do you believe? Then you still get about 70% that say, I'm Christian. If you ask them, do you go to church? You get into the single digits, right? And so that Christianity is clearly a different type of Christianity than when you ask it in Poland or in the US, where you still have massive groups that go. And then we have had progressive gains. Now, what is important, because it definitely doesn't feel like it, but we have had progressive gains, but not in socio-economic terms, but in social-cultural terms. Obviously, the gains were much smaller in policies and policy outcomes than in discourse. But over the last couple of decades, particularly in the global north, but also a lot in the global south, Latin America being a very good example, we have had a massive shift with regard to gender rights, with regard to sexuality. And again, Latin America being a very good example, we have had significant policy changes there. After pretty much a period of decline in the 80s, 90s, where they weren't really very high on the agenda. And so what does that do? It has created a sense of urgency and threat among religious people, but also among right-wing people, even non-religious right-wing people. They feel threatened on the one hand by Islam, but also by the left. And I think what you see is two responses on the right. You see an embrace of religion by the radical right, and you see a radicalization of the religious right. There's a point I want to make because I missed that in a lot of the debate in the US, for example, about Trump, or before that, the Tea Party, which for some reason is written out of the history of this country. As everyone always talks about Fox. Like, Fox didn't start anything. Some still remember talk radio. But there's another radio, which is Christian radio. Now, having had the good fortune of living in Indiana for a couple of years, and as soon as you're outside of Indianapolis on your way to South Bend, you only have talk radio, Christian radio, and country. As far as country does politics, it's on the right. Talk radio, consistently. I had the fortune of listening to Mark Levine driving up here. He was on fire. And, but we forget about the Christian radio. which is also deeply political and has become much more apocalyptic in its discourse. And so this radicalization of the religious right is a very important element. It is a radicalization of both the views and of the urgency to become active. A consequence of all of this is that we have seen, and we increasingly see, a convergence of the mainstream, radical, and religious right. Top is one of the online activities of Vox, a far-right party in Spain, which Vox had traditionally mainstream right people like Uribe. It had far-right people like Viktor Orban, Giorgia Meloni. It also had religious right, not directly seeing them here, but they had earlier made a charter of Madrid, which was signed by all kinds of politicians, but also by representatives of religious organizations. But you see this convergence actually the best in Latin America at the moment. And the two best examples are Brazil and Chile. And in both of these, like, we always had this, like, because presidential elections are winner takes all, right? And so everyone on one side will have to work together. But traditionally, at the head of the right-wing bloc was the mainstream right. Today, at the head of that bloc is Bolsonaro and his caste, the radical right. The religious right plays a major role, particularly in Brazil, pushing like turnout and other things, but it goes under that heading of a radical right candidate. That is possible because of the radicalization of the religious right. They also very strongly share issues and frames. Right? Gender and sexuality are increasingly replacing immigration in a variety of countries, and in much of the global south, immigration never was the main issue. It was always things like that. But you see gender and sexuality very central in Central and Eastern Europe for the radical right, the populists there, in the south as well. And then wokeness, whatever term, because different countries have different terms. And wokeness is to a certain extent the most recent iteration of communism, is kind of the left socialism, whatever. But one of the things is that the discourse around that almost all originated on the radical right. And it is adopted now by mainstream right and by religious right. There's a little bit of an exception, the Vatican. The Vatican has also played a major role in the terminology and the arguments about gender and sexuality. And these have actually been partly integrated into the radical right. But most of the woke debate or the transgender debate, like the terminology, comes from the radical right and is now being posted not just by the Conservative Party in Britain or the Republican Party here, but even the Christian Democrats in Germany take up that type of thing. And so this brings them to a shared struggle. But this shared struggle also has a populist element to it. Like, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the term cultural Marxism. Also has a very long history. It's the idea that the Marxists, the communists, because they're always there, they're no longer about class politics. It's now about changing the culture, perverting nations, particularly through this. And if you're a nationalist, gender and sexuality go directly to the core, because core is reproduction. Right? And so if women are not women anymore, they don't become mothers, and if you don't have mothers, you don't have offspring. If you have same-sex couples, you don't have offspring. Right? And so for them, that is at the key. For the religious right, there's another argument for that. And the mainstream right has yet another argument. But they all can agree that the development is wrong. And because of that sense of urgency, they also all feel that radical politics are needed now. That you can't do the old thing anymore. But it is important that gender and sexuality, the wokeness, it's not only shared by populists. Putin is a very good example. Now, I know that Putin is also included in populism because everyone is, but Putin is neither a nationalist nor a populist. Actually, Putin barely ever references the people in a moral sense, let alone that he puts himself as just one of the people. Now, whether Putin is upset by transgender singers who win the Eurovision or whether he is actually just trying to get a Western audience is irrelevant. It is picked up more so on the right necessarily than on the populist right, which again, the element of how important populism is problematic here. So why do I think it's a transactional alliance? In my opinion, most religious populists are religious in a cultural sense. And so this is what Rogers Brubaker calls Christianism or identitarian Christianism. It's where you see, where you define your culture as Christian, but not in a religious sense, but purely in a cultural sense. The Netherlands is a very good example. There are a lot of people who say, I jokingly call myself regularly a secular Calvinist. So, and Calvinism is a relatively strong religion in the Netherlands. I'm third generation atheist, and yet a lot of the values that I grew up with are typical Calvinist. It's about modesty, hard work. The only dumb thing about being a secular Calvinist, you don't get your reward in the afterlife, which is it's the dumbest thing to be, actually. Right? And so what we saw, particularly because of 9/11, was, hey, the other is a Muslim. We are kind of not really religious, but Christian values are part of us. Right? And so you see that radical right parties increasingly now define themselves as Christian or Judeo-Christian. Judeo-Christian means not Muslim. Like, it's a euphemism. There is, of course, no Judeo-Christian religion. And as far as there are values that are shared by Judaism and Christianity, many of them are also shared by Islam. Judeo-Christian was a term that also was mostly used on the far right before 9/11. And now is used all over the place, not just by Steve Bannon. And so these populists are not going to call for life according to the Bible. Actually, the Bible, by and large, is never mentioned. It is vague Christian values. Most of them are shared by everyone. Now, on the other side, you have what I would call here then the populist religious. And they are populist only instrumentally. And I'm going to get some disagreement here, but I know there's a lot of research on Erdogan in Turkey as a populist. And there are a lot of examples of Erdogan using populist discourse. But he also doesn't use it consistently. There are periods in which he uses it more, and in other periods he goes back to Islam and Islamism. I think that is what most of the politicians who are truly religious will do. They use it at times, but not at other times. And it is only possible in kind of a propaganda sense. Like in the ideological sense, I think it would be much harder for them to make a case for both Islamism and populism. Because as I said before, you have opposing norms and most importantly, who is the most important thing. So that's it. Thank you very much.
You're watching CNET, Center County's Government and Educational Access Network.